before we had gritty reboots or galaxy-spanning sagas, there was one family, lost among the stars. From 1965 to 1968, Lost in Space delivered campy charm, unforgettable characters, and moments that quietly shaped sci-fi history. But behind the blinking lights and rubber-suited aliens, there's a world of stories fans rarely hear. Buckle up for 6 viral facts about Lost in Space that might just surprise you. Let's start with the version of Lost in Space most fans have never seen, the pilot that almost changed everything.
Before the Lost in Space, we know an unaired pilot titled No Place to Hide set a much darker tone. And shockingly, it featured no Dr. Smith and no robot at all. This 1965 pilot focused strictly on the Robinson family's fight for survival after a meteor storm sends their ship off course to a harsh planet teeming with cyclopean aliens. It was an impressive, straight sci-fi adventure, quite unlike the campier series that eventually aired. The pilot's budget was a then astronomical $600,000, around $4.5 million today, reflecting elaborate sets and effects. Though never broadcast at the time, it remained unseen by the public for decades. This costly episode hinted at a more intense show than the lighter-hearted Lost in Space that fans came to love.
But it wasn't just the show's structure that evolved. One character in particular flipped the tone upside down, and it wasn't by accident.
In the early scripts of Lost in Space, Dr. Zachary Smith was intended as a one-note villain slated to be written out quickly. Even actor Jonathan Harris realized they'd have to kill me off in 5 episodes if he played the role as originally written. Not keen on losing his job, Harris took matters into his own hands. Midway through Season 1, he began rewriting his lines and ad-libbing in a flamboyantly campy style, turning the saboteur into a cowardly comic relief character. The producers, seeing this resonated with audiences, let Harris run with it. Dr. Smith soon evolved into the show's quirky centerpiece, a pompous, lovable foil always cooking up schemes and hurling inventive insults at the robot. Harris's improvisation not only saved the character from early demise, but also gave Lost in Space its most memorable, if hapless, antagonist.
While Dr. Smith stole scenes with his wit, the real star behind the scenes may have been the family's high-priced ride through the cosmos.
Despite its family-oriented charm, Lost in Space spared no expense on production design, notably with the Jupiter 2 spacecraft. The futuristic flying saucer that carried the Robinsons had an estimated price tag of $350,000 in mid-1960s. Money about $2.6 million today. In fact, building the Jupiter 2 cost more than constructing the USS Enterprise for the original Star Trek. This might surprise sci-fi fans, given the Enterprise's iconic status. The difference came down to scope. Lost in Space's ship was smaller, but fully shown on screen, whereas Star Trek's larger starship had many areas never seen, allowing for more budgetary shortcuts. The hefty investment in Jupiter 2's detail paid off in a visually rich environment, an entire futuristic home for the spacefaring family.
Speaking of iconic, there's one line that outlived the show by decades, even if it was barely spoken at all.
Ironically, the most famous line from Lost in Space, "Danger, Will Robinson," was only ever spoken once in the entire series. The show's beloved robot frequently blared "Danger, danger," with flailing arms during crises, but it almost never personalized the warning with Will Robinson's name. In fact, the full phrase, "Danger, Will Robinson," appears in just a single Season 3 episode, despite later becoming the robot's signature quote in pop culture. That lone utterance, however, was unforgettable. It resonated so strongly with viewers that it took on a life of its own beyond the show, echoed in countless parodies, ads, and the 1998 Lost in Space film. Much like "Beam me up, Scotty," never said verbatim in Star Trek, "Danger, Will Robinson" became a legendary sci-fi catchphrase, even if original fans rarely heard it on 1960s TV.
Now, if the robot's design felt familiar to sci-fi fans, that's because its creator had already made history in another galaxy, far, far away. Well, kind of.
If the Lost in Space robot ever looked familiar, that's because he had a famous relative in sci-fi history. The show's B9 robot was designed by Robert Kinoshita, the very same designer behind Robby the Robot from the classic 1956 film Forbidden Planet. Kinoshita gave both robots their iconic glass-domed heads and clunky cybernetic charm. In a fun crossover twist, Robby the Robot actually guest-starred on Lost in Space, appearing in 2 episodes, Season 2's War of the Robots and Season 3's Condemned of Space, as a robot prison guard. These cheeky cameos delighted fans, effectively bringing 2 iconic robots face to face. While the Robinsons' loyal robot and Forbidden Planet's Robby never officially acknowledged their kinship, viewers loved the nod to sci-fi's interwoven universe, all thanks to Kinoshita's creative touch behind the scenes.
And finally, behind the calm, maternal figure of Maureen Robinson was an actress with one of the wildest commutes in TV history.
Maureen Robinson was the gentle, grounded heart of Lost in Space, but actress June Lockhart had a decidedly more eccentric side off-screen. One of her favorite hobbies was antique vehicles, so much so that she often drove a 1923 fire engine to the studio for filming. This bright red vintage fire truck, endearingly named Cordelia, became her daily ride to 20th Century Fox. The sight of TV's Space Mom barreling down Los Angeles streets in a clanging old fire engine must have turned heads. It certainly made an impression on the studio. Lockhart was granted the largest parking space on the lot to accommodate her unusual vehicle. The quirky commute was a far cry from Maureen Robinson's prim homemaker image, showing that Lockhart in real life was just as adventurous as her on-screen family was in space.
Lost in Space may have faded from prime time decades ago, but its legacy lives on, not just in the catchphrases and costumes, but in the oddball stories behind the scenes that make classic TV feel so alive. From fire trucks to forgotten pilots, this 1960s show packed more surprises than you'd ever expect from a sci-fi family drama. Who knows? Maybe it's time to revisit the stars, one campy space adventure at a time.